Thank you, thank you. This is a truly international event. So we start off with the Portuguese talk and then French. And now I'm afraid we're in English. So my apologies. Actually, I was told never to apologize, so ignore that last sentence. When I'm asked what the challenges are for Freemasonry in the 21st century, and where is Freemasonry going, and what do we have to do to improve it, I normally respond, I'm a historian, not a futurologist. But the big advantage of history is that it holds a mirror to the present and it opens a window onto the future. And what we can do with history is examine those periods in time when Freemasonry commanded the heights of society, and those periods in time when it didn't, when it failed, when it went into retreat. And I'm going to explore the 20th century through the medium of the 18th century and look at 3 or 4 periods of time. The inception of Freemasonry in England, the beginning, 1717, through the 1720s, period of phenomenal growth. And then the late 1730s and 1740s, when it spiraled into decline in a period of really no more than 20 years after its founding in London. And then a resurgence in the second half of the 18th century. And the common factors amongst each of these periods are leadership, relevance, morality, sense of purpose. And those factors are just as relevant and important today. And if we look to the future, I think we look to the future bearing in mind those factors. And considering the past, we might therefore also consider the future. So let me begin with the early 18th century. 1717, the coming together of 4 lodges to form the first Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. Didn't get a lot of publicity. No one really knew what was going on until 4 years later, 1721. When there was a major event, and that major event was the agreement of the Duke of Montagu, John, 2nd Duke of Montagu, to become the first noble Grand Master of Grand Lodge. Now, what did that do? Well, it gave Freemasonry the sort of publicity that it had never had before. The new Grand Master, the John Duke of Montagu, was the George Clooney of his day. He was good looking, he was wealthy, he was married to a very popular lady, in that case, the youngest daughter of the Duke of Marlborough, great military hero, who'd been given Blenheim Palace, and if Eric will excuse me for his military endeavors over France. And he was one of the most popular men in England. His name appeared in the press on an almost daily basis. He was not only connected to the court, he was connected to the Royal Society, to the Society of Physicians. He was an Enlightenment figure. And part of his Enlightenment upbringing was his education by Huguenots, expatriate French Protestants who had fled persecution in France. So here was a figurehead, handsome, popular, absolutely the font of aspiration for both the aristocracy, the gentry, and the upper middling. And they flocked to join Freemasonry in his wake. So a newspaper cutting at the time commenting on the number of Freemasons in London just a year after he had become Grand Master. The comment was that there were now between 3,000 and 4,000 Freemasons in London. Now, this may or may not have been true, but assuming it was in the right ballpark, this was an astonishingly high number. London's population at the time was about 500,000. Half of those, of course, were female, so we exclude those from potential Freemasons. 90% of them were impoverished and couldn't afford to become Freemasons anyway. It was expensive, it was relatively elitist. So of the odd 20,000 who were left, a fifth were Freemasons within such a short period of time. Now, it wasn't down to Montagu alone. It wasn't his leadership alone that was important here. He was surrounded by a core of active, intelligent men. Deputy Grand Masters, Grand Secretaries, Grand Treasurers, almost all of whom were Fellows of the Royal Society, men like Jean-Théophilus Desaguliers, Martin Foulkes, future president of the Royal Society. So men who were, again, at the leading edge of intellectual thought, men who other men wished to be associated with. The Enlightenment was the cutting-edge philosophy of the day. And it was relevant. It taught, or preached, or advocated religious tolerance in an age where religious warfare had been the dominant theme for some 200 years, when hundreds of thousands had died across Europe as a result of the battle between Catholicism and Protestantism. So here we have religious tolerance, radical, leading edge. We have constitutionalism, an advocacy of a supreme legislature, not a divinely anointed monarch. The autocracy that dominated continental Europe, a constitutional monarch that was based on parliamentary sovereignty, on an independent judiciary, at least in theory, in practice perhaps less so. Nonetheless, these were philosophical principles that had resonance at the time. Self-improvement and education, following the ideas of Isaac Newton, observation, rational interpretation, not education at the diktat of the church. So ideas that really were cutting edge. Why then, within 20 years, did English Freemasonry go into decline, with a third or more of the lodges being expelled or leaving the Grand Lodge of England? Well, I'll go back. Leadership. The principal cause of this arrested development of Freemasonry was a new Grand Master, Lord Dudley and Weir, who had inherited a title and inherited land to the northwest of what is now Birmingham, the Black Country. His estates were built on coal, and the coal was a few inches below the surface of the land. And he grew very, very wealthy indeed as coal began to power industrialization. Now, he hadn't been a lord when he became a Freemason, but when he obtained his title, he was elevated to become Grand Master. And he was not a good Grand Master. He was not particularly intellectual. He was not particularly understanding. And he was extremely arrogant. And he insisted that the lodges within the orbit of the Grand Lodge attended the quarterly communications on a regular basis, and that they give compulsorily charity to the Grand Charity Committee, who would dispose of it as they saw fit. And lodges didn't like this. They didn't like to be forced to attend Grand Lodge, be forced to give charity contributions over which they had no control. And they began to express their concern by non-attendance. In fact, the non-attendance was so bad that even the most loyal of all the Grand Lodges, of all the lodges within the orbit of the Grand Lodge, the Stewards' Lodge, the Stewards' Lodge refused to attend. This was the lodge from which all grand officers were chosen. The Stewards' Lodge refused to attend and refused to take part in any parades in Grand Lodge. And the Grand Master declared that any lodge that had not attended Grand Lodge's quarterly communications for 2 years would be expelled, unless they explained why. And very few of them bothered to explain why, and they were so expelled. So Freemasonry went into a tailspin that accelerated in 1747 with the appointment of perhaps the worst Grand Master that the Grand Lodge of England has ever known. Lord Byron, the fourth Lord Byron, the uncle of the poet, who was the fifth Lord Byron. And the fourth Lord Byron turned up at Grand Lodge and announced that he would dedicate himself to advancing Freemasonry, do everything in his power to promote it, and then proceeded not to attend Grand Lodge for the following 7 years. In the meantime, the Grand Lodge was under the control of a rather disparate and unprepossessing group of Grand Officers who appointed their friends to office, thus alienating virtually every other lodge within the orbit of Grand Lodge. They also failed to move forward on any of the philosophical principles that their predecessors had promoted so widely, and the net result was that Freemasonry declined. It declined to such an extent that Horace Walpole, well-known author, announced at the time that Freemasonry now is held in such low regard that nothing but persecution can bring it back again. Now, it was this time, and I think it's not difficult to draw a connection, and probably for this reason, that an alternative Grand Lodge was formed in London. The Grand Lodge, according to the old institutions, the Ancients' Grand Lodge, led principally by the London Irish. And this Grand Lodge was not focused on the elites, on the aristocracy and the gentry. It was focused on the aspirational middling. Men who wanted to improve their circumstances in life, financially, educationally, who wanted to become part of polite society. The Ancients' Grand Lodge was led by titular noblemen, but its real driver, its real leader, was an Irishman by the name of Lawrence Dermot, who drove the organization forward, who coined the terms moderns to describe the original Grand Lodge of England, accusing them of having secularized Freemasonry, accusing them of having modified it, and instead, Dermot announced that ancient Freemasonry would be true to the ancient landmarks. It was the one true traditional form of Freemasonry, hence, of course, the name Ancients. Now, the reality was, of course, that it had the same Enlightenment precepts as the original Grand Lodge. It had virtually the same ritual as the original Grand Lodge, but it had much improved PR and far superior leadership, and was dedicated to mutuality, to helping men achieve their objectives of financial and educational, societal betterment. If you think about it, in those days, there was no health service, there was no safety net. The only thing that one could do would be to rely on friends and family. And the Ancients' Grand Lodge was the first proto-friendly society that institutionalized mutual support. And it did so not only locally within London, but provincially, and in short order, internationally. So from 5 founding Grand Lodges in 1751, there were 10 within a year, 20 within 2, and 200 lodges within the next few decades. 75 in London, 90 across provincial England, and the balance overseas, particularly in North America and the Caribbean. And that number excludes the tens, if not hundreds, of lodges that were warranted by the Provincial Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, established by the ancients as its first provincial Grand Lodge, just 5 years later, 1756, and those that worked without a formal warrant, of which there were many. And that form of Freemasonry, again, had leadership and relevance. It had a philosophy that had meaning to its members and was attractive to new members. And we can take that forward just a few years to the American War of Independence, where ancient Freemasonry becomes embedded in the new republic. Again, through leadership, through relevance. We see in the very first battle at Bunker Hill, one of the first men killed in that battle, certainly probably the best known, was the Grand Master of Ancient Masons in Massachusetts, Joseph Webb. When we see after the war the foundation of the State House in Boston, Massachusetts, who lays the cornerstone of the State House? Paul Revere, General Paul Revere, Grand Master of Masons in Massachusetts, war hero. Who lays the cornerstone of the Capitol building, literally cementing Freemasonry into the very foundations of America? George Washington, in a fully Masonic ceremony. Even in the boondocks of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill, founding the first public university in America. Again, the cornerstone is laid by the Grand Master of Masons in North Carolina, a future governor of the state, General William Richardson Davie. There is such a close association between Freemasonry and American independence that the tenets, the Masonic tenets that were outlined in the 1723 Constitutions, a foundational document of Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry, are repeated, as one would expect them to be, in the Declaration of Independence. After all, both documents, both the Constitutions and the Declaration, are based on Lockean principles, the philosophy of John Locke. I'm going to touch on one other thing, because colonialism has been mentioned, and Black Freemasonry has been mentioned. I think it's worthwhile just commenting briefly on that. Prince Hall Freemasonry, the first Black Freemasonry to be established. Prince Hall went to the lodges in Massachusetts seeking recognition for his Africa Lodge, #1. And he was turned down. Now, it could be argued that it was a matter of regularity, but I suspect that that was not the case. So Prince Hall turned to the Grand Lodge of England and said, "Can we have a warrant, please?" And quite remarkably, within just a few months, the Grand Lodge of England said yes. And when the fees were paid, the warrant was sent over to Boston, and Africa Lodge was opened within the week. First Black American lodge, indeed the first Black lodge. And it remained the case that Prince Hall Lodge is the only lodge in the whole of North America post-independence to still come under the direct remit of the Grand Lodge of England. Isn't that extraordinary? Isn't that extraordinary? Now, there were various issues that went on afterwards, which we haven't got time to explore. But Black Freemasonry in America, and indeed Black Freemasonry in India, occurred under the auspices either of the Grand Lodge of England or the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And at the highest levels at the Grand Lodge of England and at the Grand Lodge of Scotland, there was a true understanding that Freemasonry should be colorblind, that it should be open to all men, regardless of faith, regardless of nationality, regardless of color. So I'll come back again. You look at the development of principal Freemasonry today, you look at its leadership today, and again, leadership, relevance. Thank you very much.